of talking with one of the masters of modern music, Mr. Max Roach, a major force in the percussion of modern music as a composer, as a band leader, as an educator, and as a thinker about what this very important culture means. Good afternoon, Mr. Roach. That was certainly a powerful introduction, or hello, if you will. I think the interesting thing about it is that statement is really related to your very earliest musical experiences, that underneath the elaboration, the complexity that you lay down are some things that you learned in your very earliest musical experiences in the church and in the marching bands, that drum and bugle corps experience that you had in association with the church. Would you care to recapitulate that history for us, that period in your life?
Well, Bill, I grew up in the church. Having been born in North Carolina, coming from a Bible family, all the activity, cultural activity centered in the church. And I was introduced to music by way of the church choir and musical instruments by way of the church after-school activities. And the drums was my first instrument that I had I had occasion to play with the church marching band. And the first things, of course, I learned were marches. And it seemed as though at every parade, this was in Brooklyn, New York, that the citizens could, that were organized in the New York City, Brooklyn, and Harlem, our little marching band was asked to participate. And I guess you might say my earliest introduction to the drums was in the marching band out of Concord Baptist Church, Brooklyn.
Now that included everything from Garvey marches to American Legion marches, yeah, a whole gamut of things.
If you want to say, we marched in Garvey parades, Marcus Garvey parades, American Legion Day parades, and Sunday school parades, Brooklyn Day parades, New York Day parades, whatever.
The competitions and things between these groups?
We engaged in marching band competitions as well. This, however, happened while in grade school and also in high school in the marching bands. And we had an opportunity to exchange ideas with other marching bands in the city, white marching bands, other black marching bands. And we learned that our style was a bit more laid back and not as militaristic as perhaps some of the other bands around the city.
Could you demonstrate for us what that laid-back style was, and maybe some of the rhythms that you were playing, some of the routines that you played at that time?
Yeah, I believe I can, if I can remember some of those.
Your early experiences in the church have been important to you, both in terms of introducing you to the drums and learning, the basic rudiments of the instruments, but also the vocal music that was happening in the church has had a profound effect on your work subsequent in your career, the recordings that you made in the late 50s and the 60s that drew so heavily on gospel and the spiritual tradition in the black church, the stuff you did with the J.C. White singers, things that you did with Abby, things that you did with Andy Bay, you know, all drew from that source. Would you care to share with us just what that influence was and some of the other musical training that you had in addition to the drum and bugle corps experience that, you know, emanated from the church?
Well, as I said earlier, the church was the fountainhead, I guess, if you say, our musical culture, and singing was a dominant part of that. Everyone sang. We had the children's choir, young people's choir, young adults choir, and choir after choir. Everyone had to participate in that activity, other than just playing with the marching band and whatever things that we did. After school, when we finished school, we'd go to the church. It was like a daycare center in a sense. When you grew up in the church, most of your days were spent in the church. And so naturally, the people who took care of the children while your mother or your parents, or your mother and father went out looking for work, during that time, kept you busy, either singing, learning how to play instruments, etc. So most of us were well versed in the spirituals. Most of us played a little piano. We played for each other, we took turns, and we sang for each other. And of course, we prepared programs for different occasions, Easter programs, Christmas programs. Every Sunday we'd rehearse for this, for whatever program or whatever was going on with our choirs as well. And often or not, I had occasion to play piano as well as sing. And to give you some idea of some of the things that we were engaged in at that time, I'll go to the piano and perhaps sing some for you and play as well. You know, my aunt, who was a church pianist, was the first one to teach me and my brother how to read music. And of course, we learned out of hymnal books. And one of my favorite books was the James Weldon Johnson's Negro Spirituals, where you found not only the popular spirituals like Standing in the Need of Prayer, and Sometimes I feel like a motherless child, but you also found rare spirituals, and I'd like to sing one of these for you. This is called Singing with a Sword in My Hand, and it was also a spiritual that was, in a sense, I guess it was a militant or a spiritual of preparedness. And all these songs, of course, had double meanings. And it goes something like this. I'm singing with my sword in my hand. I say I'm singing with my sword in my hand. Yeah, I'm singing with my sword in my hand, Lord, Lord. I'm singing with my sword in my hand. Prettiest singing ever I heard, way over on the hill. The angels sing, and I sing too. I'm singing with my sword in my hand.
You know, you mentioned in talking about the spirituals, the double entendre aspect of them, the yearning in a religious sense and a yearning in an earthly sense for freedom. Mm-hmm. Do you want to? You had a nice little line about what you felt that song was really saying.
Well, that's one of the songs that tells you to be prepared for any occasion or in whatever situation that you are in. You know, he says, the poet says, singing with the sword in my hand, and then the next verse is praying with the sword in my hand. The next verse would be moaning with a sword in my hand. And so in any situation that you are involved in, the song says that you should be prepared to protect yourself and whatever else. So many of the earlier spirituals were loaded with messages that taught you, much like the church does today, how to survive out here. And of course, these were not only songs of inspiration, but they were songs of preparation and songs of protection. And in many ways, it kept, it has helped us to survive to where we are today, no matter how critical situations were for us as a people in the United States, you know.
Is that why you decided in the late 50s to go to this body of material, you know, in relationship to what was going on in society at that point in Afro-American civil rights and human rights struggles?
Well, that was one of the reasons, and I thought during the 50s and 60s, during that period after the tragic accident that tore apart the band with Clifford Brown and Richard Powell, I became involved, as most people did, in the civil rights movement. And of course, the Martin Luther King was on the scene, Malcolm X was on the scene. I guess you just couldn't help but be involved in it. There was so much activity, and the whole country was involved in these issues of freedom and hope, and I ain't gonna study war no more, those kinds of things. And that was certainly one of the reasons, and a very important one. But also, I had always had the feeling that the intellectuals, black intellectuals, and the black church, because jazz musicians made their living in nightclubs, theaters, were oftentimes, and most oftentimes, neglected in their studies. And so, you know, like the church, we could play our march music. Of course, we dealt with spirituals, but instrumental music, jazz, was forbidden. And so when I got the opportunity to, and was asked for things to record by record companies, it was my desire to bring these two forces together. Why not use a gospel choir and jazz musicians, put them in the studio, and develop some music that they both could live with. And the particular, due to the fact it was the 50s and 60s, the kind of material I used was something like we just heard, Singing with a Sword in My Hand, Joshua, you know, fit the Battle of Jericho.
Members Don't Get Weary.
Members Don't Get Weary. Were You There When They Crucified My Lord? Which to me was a spiritual that was a testament to a lynching, And all those kinds of things were the spirituals that we chose, and we used the gospel choir and jazz musicians who improvised all through the arrangements. And incidentally, when I did this, when I made this record, it's called Lift Every Voice and Sing, that was the last record I did with Atlantic Records. I was signed with Atlantic at that time, and it was a funny situation. I remember being called in by the people in charge of artists and recordings, and I had known these folks for years, the people who had started Atlantic Records. They started in the 40s with us on 52nd Street, and we were friends as well as people who worked together to make this music, and it was just when the turnaround was coming up, and turnaround, I mean political turnaround, and they were retooling, asking the artists now to back off from what we call protest music, or music that spoke about not just black artists, but all artists, the Buffy St. Marie people who were doing things at that time, across the board, all our pop artists, you know, we were, some of our best pop artists were recording things like Keep On Pushing and all these kinds of things. And they called me in and they said to me, well, Max, you know, you've been in the business quite some time. You should really make some, it's time for you to really make some money. So I said, well, yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. I said, how do we go about that? Well, then they were telling us that we had to retool what we were doing, and he gave me a stack of records of pop music that related to dance, to a pop culture. And there's nothing wrong with that, because I do believe that we should have, that our culture serves more than one purpose. It's for enlightenment, it's for entertainment, it's to relax with, it's to think by, and all these things. It's to worship by, and so forth. But they gave me some pop records strictly for dance. And during that same period, all the artists were asked to retool and not be as serious and as original about what was going on around us politically. And musically, the music just changed. We went right into a total dance bag, and that's what was marketed, and these are the things that were sold to the public. I remember the last time I came here to Howard University, I was in one of the art professors' offices talking, and we had the Howard University radio on, and they were playing, of course, what was current at the time, same thing as LIB, or the sister station in New York. Music was being pumped out so that we could jump up and dance, and he posed the question as to how can you think and dance at 3 o'clock in the afternoon and work and study at the same time. Obviously, it's being done. And then with all the things that we as a group have endured in this country that have been fostered on us, I see us surviving, you know, even though we were inundated with music that you would assume that might take us away from some of the real issues that were plaguing our people. I think we're coming back almost full circle now, because many of the artists are beginning again to look at the world not through rose-colored glasses, so to speak, but from the reality that it is, because there are no jobs, there are no things, and they're beginning to speak to these things a little bit more than they were in the previous 10 years.
Excuse me. One of the really, probably the classic record in terms of making a social statement that you produced, I mean the classic record of that type, and it's a record that you produced, was the We Insist Freedom Now Suite session. And it was so important because it brought together so many things. It brought you together with Coleman Hawkins, with whom you'd worked in 1943 and 44, and represented, once again, a statement about the unity of generations in jazz. It brought forth, in a very profound way, the kind of vocal things that you were exploring with Abbey Lincoln, a freer use of the voice and a kind of collective improvisation with the voice. It brought into focus your experiments with meters other than 4/4, and so that it made a broader statement. It also anticipated the current furor that's now going on about South Africa. You did the piece Tears for Johannesburg, which reflected upon the Sharpsville Massacre. So that was such a seminal record. Perhaps now we could listen to the Driver Man piece from that, and then, you know, go into some further discussion of that record as a kind of a summation of a period and a really statement that brought together many strands in your career.
Another aspect of that record here is bringing in an African.
Okay.
Going to guess not the piece I'm talking about, though.
What's the meter here?
6/8.
Can you, after we get this, will you play some 6/8 naked from this?
Mm-hmm.
So, and then we can say,
here?
yeah. In other words, we'll do some 6/8. Okay. Okay, I know what to do with this. I know how to handle this. We'll say this piece means an African, and let's hear 6/8. We'll go to another thing. The interesting thing about that piece is that it shows us the bringing together with, the bringing into the African element into the music, and shows us a time signature that was not often utilized, which is the 6/8. Would you care to go to the drum set and just isolate that signature for us? Credited to be the first one to actually swing a waltz. Can you give us a little taste of 3/4 and how you make it swing, so to speak? I think the other signature that you worked in pretty extensively would be 5/4. Can we hear some of that? One of the other features of the We Insist session was the involvement of Coleman Hawkins. And to illustrate how the music is actually, what we're talking about is a continuum of musical culture, let's listen to Driver Man and Coleman Hawkins' participation in this session.
get to work and root that stump. Drive a man will make you jump. Better make your hammer ring. Drive a man will start to swing. Ain't for two things on my mind. Drive a man and quit time.
You want to comment in here about you want to comment in here?
Yeah. Want to reflect on your association with Mr. Hawkins and his participation in this session?
Well, there was this recording and the different levels that was, at least was going through my mind when performing it. It was a recording that grew out of a commission piece that Oscar Brown Jr. and myself had been commissioned by the NAACP Youth Organization, and it was first introduced at the Philadelphia NAACP Convention to commemorate 100 years in 1960 of the Emancipation Proclamation. And the piece Freedom Now Sweet. So what we attempted to do was to create a work that used dance, narration, film, stills, song, to say that in 100 years from 1860 to 1960, that we had attained freedom. Well, Oscar and I, we labored on this piece for months. I'd be on the road, we'd work on it by telephone, and we never could finish the piece because we knew in our minds and hearts that we had not arrived at a place where we could say this is total freedom. Hence, the last piece we did was called Freedom Day, and it asked a question. Whisper, listen, they say we're free. Whisper, listen, is it really true, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And the piece ends like that. But involved in the piece, we brought in several elements musically. There was Michael Olatunji, who was from Africa, Ray Montier from Puerto Rico, all from East Harlem by way of Puerto Rico and South America. Heritage-wise, there was a Cuban percussion in it, potato. And then there was also, of course, jazz musicians, and Coleman Hawkins. the gentleman whom gave me my first record date, I had finally an opportunity to ask him would he be kind enough or disposed to record on a recording session of mine, and he was gracious enough to do so. And so it meant a great deal to me, and it also meant we also had an opportunity to explore new forms. For example, we used 5/4, which is in the piece we just heard, to create the kind of tension that was supposed to exemplify that the offness that 5/4 and odd meter would create in a work situation, to create some kind of unbearable musical tension, supposedly. And then we did some free-form things, and this is in the triptych piece. It's a duet between voice and drums, where the piece was created on images, not so much the melody and changes. For example, in triptych, the 3 parts of triptych is prayer, protest, and peace. And it's not a prayer of supplication, it's a prayer of preparation. This comes out of the church, you might say. And the protest follows that what you prepare yourself to do, to go out and do it full force. So protest is like, say, if you get yourself ready to do something and then you come out and do it full out until you just totally exhaust yourself. And then you find peace in doing everything you could to satisfy the preparation that you were involved in prior to your protest. And the peace is not a peace that means that you have really won or lost something or whatever. It's the peace that comes from you just extending yourself. And it's around, because then you pray to prepare yourself again to go into another protest, and then to exert yourself, and then you do that fully, and then the peace is coming in. The peace means that you have completely satisfied some part of yourself.
That piece also was an early example of what came to be known later as free jazz. That is,
free form, yeah.
Jazz that did not involve a preset harmonic, rhythmic, or melodic framework.
Yeah,
and you told me an interesting story about
the dominant seventh, so to speak. Yes.
You told me that John Coltrane had an interesting reaction to this piece.
Yeah, John's reaction to it was that what he told me was it substantiated the direction that he was into and going into, that you can deal with sound and completely eliminate the conventional and structured aspects of music that would have been the perfect marriage of harmony, melody, and rhythm. That means you could just deal with sounds itself and be involved in sounds emotionally.
Maybe what we can do right now is go to a portion of the triptych and hear what you're discussing.
I'd like to see that first section. That first section, it might work out though.
So this is where you insert it.
He got out of the CIA of lynchings, and crowds marching, and things like that to exemplify certain things. And I guess he was in a studio the size of this in Rome. He pasted all these pictures on the walls and on the floor and used overhead cameras and handheld cameras. It's almost like a moving picture. The way he would move in, like in a section like this, to a forest, and all of a sudden you'd see a group of people, and he'd zero in. Hold it. Okay.
Can we go to I'm sure in the course of your career in making music of this type, very powerful music, very direct music, music that addresses itself to things that are maybe not necessarily pleasant, you know, you've been confronted with the question of the fact that this music is not comfortable music, that this is music that it's not like the kind of music you go into a nightclub and, you know, kick back with a scotch to. How do you address yourself to your purposes as an artist?
Well, it's theatrical. A film was made to this music by an Italian filmmaker, Freedom Now Sweet, and he did it with stills and slides. And in this particular piece, the first section, which was the preparation of the triptych, you'd see. What he did was you'd see, say, he panned the camera on a group of people who looked like they were having a picnic, and it was a serene scene, you know, in the deep South. Families who were standing around eating hot dogs or whatever. And then when it got to that screaming section, the camera panned on a lynching. So here was a group of white families, children, and so forth. And this film he got from, Gianni Amici was the filmmaker, said he got it from the CIA, of a group of citizens witnessing a black man being lynched who was hung on a tree. And so in directing it to what Abby was doing, she would be just a young black woman walking through the forest, and all of a sudden she sees a man hung up on a tree with his neck broke and his privates cut off of his body. And that reaction is what she would have hit immediately. And so it's theatrical. But for us, it was also to take outside sounds like screams and hollers and create some kind of musical texture with them and to create a design with it. And that was what we were after in the whole piece.
Another important aspect of this recording is the statement that you made with respect to South Africa, Tears for Johannesburg. Do you want to talk a little bit about that piece?
Well, the record itself got into South Africa because it was considered a jazz record, okay? And the album notes was written by Nat Hentoff. I would say he's a social jazz critic. Speaks about this particular piece, Tears for Johannesburg, was to commemorate the memory of all those young people who were killed in Johannesburg during a military insurrection on the students of Johannesburg at that time. A similar thing happened recently in Soweto. And so that piece was dedicated to them, and that, of course, when dealing with the album notes, he would ask the artist, well, why did you write this piece? And I said, well, it was a dedication to all those students who were killed in Johannesburg during that period. And he wrote this in the liner notes. But as I'm a jazz musician, the record got into South Africa as a jazz album until they read the liner notes and saw that it was really a protest album that not only had to do with America and its sociological problems, but also with South Africa and her problems. And so it was taken and it was barred from being further imported into South Africa, and it reached the national press, and the record became it almost reached the kind of popularity that went into pop records because the Times warranted it. It was during the 60s and everybody's mind was on trying to do something with the world as it was today, with the war and with the Vietnam War, with the civil rights movement, et cetera, et cetera. So it became a little light hit because of the fact that the press had noted that it had been barred in South Africa. In fact, it still is.
These kinds of recordings, and I guess the recording It's Time and Percussion Bittersweet could be included with this, sort of led to a lot of controversy in your career and a lot of debates and discussions about racism in jazz and music for music's sake and music as propaganda and those kinds of things. What kind of impact do you think this had on your career and that discussion had on that whole debate had?
Well, you know, jazz was never the kind of a popular art form where, popular I mean that you sold thousands of records or played to hundreds of thousands of people on your concert. So it didn't affect me in that way, actually, but in fact it was just the opposite. I became a person who had ideals about things about the world, that the political and sociological situations that go on in the world, and especially in the United States of America. For me, it was favorable. I was happy that I could, for whatever music is worth in a situation like that, I could speak out against some of the injustices through my music during that particular period. I was criticized because people said, well, art should not be used for propaganda purposes, or art is for the sake of art only, and it stands alone and by itself. And there were all kinds of arguments, and of course these things, I don't believe that's true anyway. For me, disco is a diversionary tactic to, just total disco. Say, if we just danced and had fun and partied all the time, we'd never have an opportunity to look at what's really going on around us. We could be led into war, they could drop an atom bomb, we could be jobless, but as long as our culture can take us into that never, never land and dream world solely, not that we shouldn't do that occasionally, but we should have something else to balance that off. Some reality should sneak in once in a while, not just a steady diet of disco and Jaws and extraterrestrial films and all these kind of things. We get into a world where we don't even know what reality is anymore. You know, culture can be used just to choreograph our minds and take us from one place to another place, and we can live in a fantasy world, and most of us do. How many people can really identify honestly with a film like Dallas? But most people live vicariously that life. It's a popular show because the majority of the people watch it. But so we're kind of living their lives vicariously and then going out into the streets where we have to struggle with all kinds of things as people. I'm talking about all the people of the country. And so, you know, these are the things that you question. So I didn't mind the criticism I got because I know that Dallas is also propaganda. If it can take me away from the reality and I can go to bed dreaming about the scenes that go on there and the luxury and all the riches that these people are enjoying, and I take that with me, get up in the next morning, I go to my little position in society and sit down, and I'm still there. I'm still living that life that I left last night on that tube. And so I'm not thinking about the fact that there is racism still exists, that there's police brutality, that there's joblessness, you know, just things that are plaguing us today and have been plaguing us. So this was an attempt at just using music to give us another aspect of what the power of art is. I think that the things that Picasso did against that were anti-war things were powerful things, and they evoked thought. You could think. When I went to his exhibition, I saw some of the things he did. It was meaningful to me. I think art, all art, everything is political.
Lest we get too far away from the drums, let's talk about some of the players that in your development were influential. Men like Chick Webb and O'Neill Spencer and Cozy Cole and Joe Jones. These were men that preceded you, that are your fathers, so to speak, in the continuum. Would you care to go to the drum set once again and maybe show us some of the things that you picked up from those masters? And also, I would like you to reflect on the great Kenny Clarke, who, along with yourself, was a great innovator in this music in the modern period and just recently passed.
Well, Kenny Clarke definitely was father of that whole bebop period. He explored different uses of time, in the sense that the way he dealt with the bass drum in respect to what was being done with the drum set itself. Broken rhythms, still in 4/4 time and things like that. And another thing about Kenny Clarke that was also very important was that he was a drummer. You know, drummers prior to, say, people like Kenny Clarke were considered drummers and not necessarily musicians. Kenny Clarke was a fine musician. He was a fine composer. He was a multi-instrumentalist. When he was in his early development, he played vibraphones as well as drums, and in one of his first recordings that he made in Sweden when he was over there in the late 30s. And so he was an inspiration, not only as a great drummer, but also as a very, very fine musician. So his influence on me was very important in my own development. That, well, then, you're not just a timekeeper, but you also have to be involved in every aspect of the music, as a composer, as a songwriter, etc. And all these things he did, and he did them well. Chick Webb, of course, was a great solo drummer who spawned the first lady of jazz, as she is called, Ella Fitzgerald. And he was important because he was one of the, I guess, one of the first drum band leaders who made a lasting impact on solo drumming. And I was very interested in that aspect of drumming too. He put the drums right out there in front as a band leader, the same as Earl Hines did the piano, and Duke Ellington did as a pianist, and Benny Carter and people like that did as great band leaders and great soloists. O'Neill Spencer was, I guess you'd call him the premier drummer for small bands. He worked with the John Kirby band that had Charlie Chavis and folks like that. He was a master of the brushes. Papa Joe Jones was one of the great inventors and innovators of all times in what he could do with any part of the drum set. Cozy Coles was the consummate technician as far as dealing with all aspects of rudimentary drumming and more, and making it swing. Cozy Coles was with Cab Calloway, and Sidney Catlett, who was another consummate drummer who worked with Louis Armstrong, who just did everything well, not only as an accompanist, but also as a soloist. And these folks, they profoundly influenced my ideas about how to deal with the drum set. If I may, I'd like to just give you an example of one of these folks to give you some idea as to some of the things that they do, and that's Papa Joe Jones. And he could play any part of the drum set and make it sound musical.
Would you just discuss for us in a little bit of technical detail what you were involved with right there on the hi-hat?
Well, it proves that the drum kit has unlimited possibility as far as sound is concerned. Like drummers like Papa Joe Jones, that was something taken from his repertoire. Papa Joe Jones was that great drummer who was with the early Count Basie band, when Basie had people like all those creative giants like Lester Young and Harry Sweets Edison, Herschel Evans, and that group of just very, very fine musicians out of Kansas City. But drummers from that particular school, not only were highly individualistic. For example, I recall once we did a bebop versus New Orleans style contest. This was one of the very, very early TV shows. And we played a version of Tiger Rag, and they played a version of How High is the Moon. And on the end of Tiger Rag, there's a drum break. And instead of Baby Dodds playing on the instrument in a conventional fashion, playing all over the drum set, when they said, hold that tiger, the band stops and the drummer takes this break. He picked up the snare drum and blew on it, blew his breath on it. So it produced a sound of a roar, sounded like a roar of a tiger. And you know, it was, and so then when we played the same piece, I played, what I did, I'm supposed to be a modern person, what I did sounded conventional, because that was really outside of the drum set. It's like playing off the instrument.
Yeah.
Like he used his breath to produce a sound that had a roar to it. When you blow your breath and make a sound very close to the snare head. And they would always come up with things like that. But that's hi-hat thing is an example. You'd be playing maybe thinking that you're assuming and thinking that you're doing all kind, your speed is up, your feet are doing it, you're dancing all over the drums, and all of a sudden one of these men would just blow on the snare drum or tremble with the brushes someplace, and just they went for sounds within the instrument other than just playing and beating on the instrument itself. And so it causes you to think, and it causes you to be inventive. Today, most musicians will get caught up in saying, I'm going to play fast or do this or do that like someone else. But they were always full of surprises, and that hi-hat demonstration was just a small example of the many aspects of the drum set itself that people like Baby Dawes and Big Sidney Catlett and Papa Joe Jones and Chick Webb and Cozy Colson and them introduced. Much of it is forgotten today.
Probably the first point in your career when all of these influences could kind of find a coherent expression as a soloist was during the extensive period in which you played with Charlie Parker, ranging from, I guess, around 44, even up to around 52. Intermittently, you were basically Charlie Parker's favorite drummer. One of the classic pieces is the piece Coco, which I guess was recorded on your very first session with Parker. Would you like to discuss your association with Parker and specifically talk about his impact in allowing you to develop and open up as a soloist, and maybe give us a taste of Coco to take this out?
Well, it would be difficult to give you a taste of Coco because Coco was Charlie Parker, but he was really instrumental in many ways in helping me to develop the drum solo as I saw it. I had a lot of freedom working with Charlie Parker. He would many times just write one sheet of music when we went into the studio to record. He'd just write a part for miles. He'd write a trumpet part. He would transpose his part from the trumpet part because alto saxophone is in a different key. And Miles is in, say, it's a B-flat concert instrument. He'd write Miles's part and then transpose it to his E-flat instrument. But the rhythm section, the bassist and the pianist, he just tell them the harmonic changes that went with the melodic line that he created, and he'd look over at me and just tell me that I had freedom to do what I wanted to do, that I would find my own way. And so this gave me the kind of freedom that that helped me to develop the drum solo, and Coco was my first long drum solo piece.
Well, I know that that Coco is a melody, and Charlie's melody, but you have a way of playing melody on drum through dynamics and through design. Can you approximate like what you would have played to set up Coco, or, you know, just give us that feeling? I know you can make me hear it. I know you can.